Seminar. Okay, so I'm starting here with, this is a picture of Konza Prairie Biological Station, where a lot of the work that I'll talk about today is done. And this is just a case where we have a tall grass prairie in between 1986, when it was a NABS meeting, actually. That's this old historic picture from a NABS meeting, which is now Society for Freshwater Sciences. And then the same spot in 2006. This is one of our weirs. You'll see long-term data from this particular weir today. And you can notice that the riparian zone is going from grassland down to the stream to what will eventually be a deciduous oak forest, to the biome, similar to the biome immediately to the east and wetter next to it. And as Julian just did, I have the land acknowledgement for Konza, and the latest natives that lived there were the Kanza tribe, and it is named after that tribe, as is the state. But the Osage and the Sioux and the Kickapoo also inhabited that area over time. And then earlier years before that, we don't have names for the tribes, but there's certainly archaeological evidence that a number of different peoples used that area. In addition, I'm in an ag experiment station school. I'm at the ag school, and those hatch funds and the land to buy that did come from selling native lands throughout the country. And so it's not a good way to have our existence, but I acknowledge that what we have now has come from that as well. I had a lot of collaborators, students and volunteers. I'll talk about the collaborators by name, as they'll be on the papers as I go through, or in the titles. But we have some large scale wood removal stuff, and that was a lot of volunteers that came out to work on the Konza. And I'm grateful for my salary, for being paid to do a job that I love, teaching and researching, and biology at Kansas State University. And then I am a part of Ag Experiment Station as well there. Funding from National Science Foundation. They've been very generous to me over the years. Missouri Department of Conservation was fabulous to work with. Nature Conservancy, I've got a grant with them currently that's fun. I'll talk about near the end. I'll talk about the importance of riparian zones today, the idea of how it might relate, the terrestrial biome that a riparian zone is embedded in, how that might relate to the function and form of the biome in the riparian zone. I'm going to give an example of woody versus grassy riparian zones and ecosystem change under shifting climate, and how that might interact with the large ungulate grazers that were there and are currently there through much of the Flint Hills, and whole watershed effects on hydrology and other things. So riparian zones are the interface between terrestrial and aquatic systems. They tend to be wetter. They tend to have more nutrients because water flows downhill and it carries nutrients with it. They perform key ecosystem services. They filter and transform pollutants, including sediments, nutrients, organic materials. They provide unique habitat for biodiversity, and they alter carbon flux to stream food webs. One of the papers that Julian and I are working on now delves into this a little bit further, because when you say riparian zone, people think you know what they're talking about, but it gets defined in different ways because it does all these different things. And you can imagine these are different areas, different parts of the interface between these. So try to talk about the importance of riparian zones. Bob Oakes was a student who ended up being an environmental lawyer, but he was a master's student. And he did some of the early GIS work, and this is a lot more work than it would be now, you know, in the early 2000s, and delineated the riparian zone in entire watersheds, 50-some watersheds in Kansas. And all these were watersheds that the Kansas Department of Health and Environment was sampling at fourth order stream stations. And then he could take out the first order, second order, third order, fourth order sections of what riparian was there, the little sub-nested watersheds for in each of those little segments or bigger segments, all the way up to the whole watershed, and the riparian zone 2 kilometers and 4 kilometers above the sampling point. And then we just did a ton of regressions, and you know, don't worry about Bonferroni correction. What we're saying here is that how much of the variance can you explain depending upon the statistical what you use as the independent variable. And these are different water quality response variables: total nitrogen, nitrate, ammonium, total phosphorus, atrazine, fecal coliform, a maximum dissolved organic. And so if we look at the whole watershed on the top, and just the land use and land cover, and then the riparian first order, second order, first order at 2 kilometers and 4 kilometers upstream from that. The first order riparian cover explains more of the variance than any other way to look at the data. If we just look at the land cover without in the whole watershed, not just the riparian, so like this one's running about 30%, and you get 40% variance explained in the riparian on the first order. The land cover in first order explains 50%. We're up to 60% if we use the riparian. So this suggests statistically there's more importance to the riparian zone in the function of removing pollutants from the water before it gets in. And then we can do this by orders in the next one. So again, the first order explains way more than the second, third, or the fourth order cover, right? I don't have the data showing here, but we also broke this down by hydrologic season. And the July, August, September time of the year is the driest year for streams there. And the first order streams are essentially all dry at that point. And even when you break it down then, and there's no water flowing down the first order streams, at the fourth order stream, the best explanatory variable for water quality at the fourth order stream is what the riparian condition is in the first order streams. And then sort of thinking about biomes and how it might vary by biomes. And on the x-axis here, we have riparian cropland, and this is through a greater portion of the Midwest based on USGS data and the nitrate concentration. And we see as the percent of riparian cropland increases, the nitrate comes up in the riparian zone. In addition to that, we have different things. The Corn Belt and different parts of this are in different ecoregions, and we see different responses to cropland across in those different ecoregions, which suggests that riparian function might vary across biomes. But cropland's not the whole story. And on this, on the right panel, we have the proportion of the watershed in urban area as a function of total phosphorus, and that's a log scale, by the way. The other one was linear scale. And this is for Sao Paulo State. And we see that very modest amounts of urbanization vastly increase, like over an order of magnitude, vastly increase the amount of total phosphorus found in those streams. The reason for that is that it's a fairly steep topography, and people tend to build at the bottom of the rivers before they go into the ocean, and they tend to build near the riparian zone because the slopes are steep. And people don't treat their sewage, and there are not phosphorus bans on detergent. Phosphorus-containing detergents are not banned. So we have these different responses, and we'll get back to the idea of human impact on riparian zones, because it's pretty evident in these two. And it may be different depending upon the biome you're in, either because of how people interact with the biome or because the biome itself has some effect. To review, biomes are based on structure and function of vegetation as the climate alters them. It's not a function of taxonomy. So if you go to a desert in North America, the cacti there look fairly similar to the plants you see in an African desert, but the taxonomy is different. But we can make predictions on primary production, the amount of standing crop of vegetation, bare soil, things like that, based on the climate using biome concepts. And the question I'm approaching is, this riparian function very predictably by the biome? So this is Holdridge, a takeoff on Holdridge's biome gradient approach, and we see precipitation increasing as we move this way down from the upper left to the lower right corner of this, and temperature increasing as we move from the top to the bottom. And we have a series of papers that a couple of papers that we put out on streams and all aquatic freshwater systems, and how they would respond overlaid to this. And what becomes really important in this is this place where potential evapotranspiration to annual precipitation is equal to 1. Because when you have that number greater than 1, you're going to have more water running off. When you have that less than 1, you're going to have the vegetation using the water before it gets to the aquatic habitat. So we'll see intermittent or ephemeral streams as we move this way across this diagram. And we'll see perennial streams as we move this way across this diagram. It will also change like the canopy. Deserts don't have much canopy over the streams. Rainforests tend to have a lot. The question then being, how does that relate to the riparian zone? Because they're wetter, we can hypothesize at least that, and what we saw in that first graph is that the grasslands are basically turning into deciduous forests as we get close to the riparian zone. And we'll see a little bit from Brazil, and we'll see a similar gradient. In deserts, you might expect them to be more like grasslands or shrubland, more shrubby as you get closer to the wetter part of this. I'll talk about some of the riparian zones that got me thinking about this, and that I've been to most of these, or at least been on projects that involve these. The land acknowledgements are next to the photo on the images. So, and this is in Tasmania. The dry eucalyptus forest is pretty much the same as you get down into the steep topography. The floods is what's changing the riparian zone, and you can see a fairly clear flood line here in this system. Moving to Mongolia, intense grazing pressure. You can see that it's wetter near the riparian zone, right? The grass is greener, and you can see it fairly clearly. This one doesn't have a land acknowledgement because it's one of the few countries in the world that is still controlled by the indigenous people over as much as we can get of recorded history. Some of the South Pacific Islands, there's a few other places in the world, but not many of them. Salmon River, okay, so we can compare this. The Salmon River is in roughly the same ecoregion, a global ecoregion as this Western Mongolia stream. And you can see the uplands here look pretty similar to the uplands here. You get really high altitude and then you're into coniferous forest. But the riparian zone is not hammered by goats. And so there's a lot more sort of willows and alders and that kind of vegetation. We're back in Kansas here, and this would have been tallgrass prairie, and you can see it up on the top. Cropland down here. Here's a flood that's just bypassing the riparian zone altogether. So flying home from a meeting in Kansas City, into Kansas City, and you can see it going here in this rather ineffective riparian zone right here at this point. Atlantic rainforest, the Lagrange. That jungle, that rainforest jungle, is that going to be different when you're close to the water or far away from the water? It's a very wet habitat, maybe not. Same question for Hawaii. This isn't a wet part of Hawaii. The stream's intermittent only because Oahu is just over appropriating water from it, basically. But is that one different? Maybe not. We can Alaska, North Slope of Alaska, becoming closer to what's near Fairbanks, and that the shrubs are starting to grow up and overtake the canopy on the side of the stream. Heavily modified habitat in Denmark, cropland right up to the edges, grassy, riparian protection a little bit on the edges. So this paper by Fan et al. Put the middle graph out, right? And we have the groundwater here, the capillary zone here, how far infiltration goes there, the water body off on the right here. Things that are next to the water body and always submerged or always waterlogged will have specific adaptations, maybe to flood, and adaptations to anoxia in the rooting zone, and perhaps never limited by water. If you move up away from this groundwater, then if you have dry seasonally, you'll have it be waterlogged sometimes and not. You move further up, water's still not limiting because the trees can get their roots down into the groundwater, but it's costing them more and more to pull that water up, right? That's an energetic cost to pull water. The further you have to carry a bucket up 3 flights of stairs full of water, and you'll know what it takes. Seasonal switching, when it rains, they'll use the water here, but if they have to, a deep-rooted plant will use if they can get in the capillary zone, they'll have water available. And then if you get up high enough, you might have a reduced size of vegetation that only can deal with surface water. When we get into dry systems, this pushes this down here, right? We're going to have a losing water body. That is, the water is going to be leaving the water body into the groundwater, and the level of the groundwater is going to be getting deeper and deeper quicker as you move away from the stream channel, compressing all this towards maybe never have always waterlogged because you have intermittent systems. So this then, so you can define this in terms of hydrology and how the riparian affects it. You can also define how it maybe affects diversity. So I flipped the water bodies over here now. We can think of plant diversity, saturation, flood adapted species nearby, seasonal inundation, seasonal with deep roots access, and eventually upland species. But these are going to overlap each other, right? That's how ecotones work. And we'll see the total diversity increasing as we move away, and then falling off and getting sort of more constant in the upland areas. So maybe this is what we would use to define the width of the riparian zone. And then you can imagine, birds, spiders, lizards, whatever you want. They follow vegetative diversity and habitat structure, and you may see similar patterns as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a shift in the riparian biome, quote unquote, with climate change. And I'm going to go to Konza Prairie Biological Station. Tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills. 98% of the tallgrass prairie in North America is gone. It's been plowed. The Flint Hills have shallow soils. They are more conducive to cattle production than row crop agriculture. This is a whole system watershed-based experiment. I talked to Daniel about that whole system research, giving us some things that we don't necessarily get. Native grazers, bison, in these central watersheds burn 2 years, 4 years annually. We'll focus on those. Ungrazed, there's some other seasonal burns. Most of them are in the spring. Some patch burn cattle grazing, and we'll talk about that with regard to another project as well. We can see in 1985 from the aerial imagery that there is some woody vegetation moving up into these riparian zones. Regardless of the burn frequency, here's the annual, the 20-year, 4-year, every other year burn, and by 2010, much more woody vegetation up in these watersheds. Okay, so we have a shifting riparian zone. How this affects the stream, we're interested in doing woody riparian removal experiments. These are 50 meters long, 30 meters wide on each side of the channel. And we just cut all the woody vegetation, use a brush cutter to get the shrubs out. We had forest down to the edge before removal, and then grass down to the edge as the third treatment. It was duplicated. So, big surprise, we open up the canopy and the algae grow. And, so the fish people were making fun of me as Keith Gitto's students, obviously. Julian knows why that happens. And that increased GP, gross primary production, to ER ratios, right? So there's more primary production. And the invertebrates follow. And actually the fish follow too, because there's fewer shredders, fewer things that eat leaves, more grazers and collectors, the things that eat algae. In addition, we didn't sample it, but we're fairly certain that the Campostum and the Foxinus, which are also herbivorous, move into those areas because there's more food available to them. I'll talk about why denitrification increased later on. We have an explanation for that. Fungal community shifted, it decreased, and it makes sense because we're knocking out part of the diversity that is close to the stream channel. So what factors might interact with this? And I mentioned large ungulate grazers, and so historically that was bison, and now it's cattle. And we did this work in Osage Prairie in Southwest Missouri, and we fenced small watersheds, and there's one small animal per watershed. And so it's called early double stocking. So it's a fairly high level, but they leave them on the pasture for a short period of time until they get fattened up enough to go to the feedlot, and then to their ultimate use by humans. So each cow had GPS collars, and we had watersheds, 4 watersheds, and we had a backy design. So before, no grazing, and then after, either they were fenced from the riparian zone or they were allowed in. These GPS are for one that had electric fence on it, and it was a patch burn. So a third of the pasture was burned each year. The third that burns has higher nitrogen grasses. Those bring the grazers in. And so the first year it was burned here, second year you can see more red here, third year blue here. And because we fenced them out of the water, we had to provide water somewhere, and we just put it up outside the riparian zone there. So they kind of, there's a blob up there that every year they were up there. See the same pattern in the one that didn't have a fence, and that's the same distance of riparian channel, but the cattle got in there. We looked at a number of things, and I'll just focus on the nitrogen in this case. So before, for the time period before, we didn't have we didn't have very much. This is not very much total nitrogen, if you know what that means. It's fairly pristine. Tall grasses prairies are pretty good at soaking up the nitrogen. And the gray part is when the cattle were on, and we see that nutrients are coming way up in those watersheds, and they're coming up more so when the riparian was fenced than I'm sorry, when the riparian was open than when it was fenced, but it didn't provide complete protection from nitrogen moving into the water streams when they're flowing. So the riparian zones are important, and keeping the cattle out had some effect. So we're going to now look at some sites at Kanza, and so there's some on Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve to the south of that. And these are some undergraduate and graduate students that have had in the lab. And then also Jess Corman, who's a colleague of mine in Nebraska, who's involved in the riparian rain manipulation. In this case, we're comparing canopy and fecal counts, 10 meters from the stream on each side, 10-meter long, and repeated transects. And we have the first thing is ungrazed, burned every 1 or 2 years, no animals per year on there. The bison, there's riparian trees 1 to 4 years. Those are the watersheds that I showed you and that were white in the previous one. But they're on the pasture 12 months a year. So bison can make it on the pasture. They're adapted to using C4 grasses, maybe shift to C3 grasses. Cattle can't handle that. They need to be supplementary fed or slaughtered before they come off. So we have cow-calf on Kanza. This is a patch burn grazing on half the year. Still low density. And this is actually commercial cattle production, few riparian trees, heavily modified by humans to cut the trees out no matter when they pop up. And they're on 6 months per year. So on Kanza, and the cattle and the bison and the patch burn have about the same fecal number of feces per square meter. Remember, these bison are putting it on about half as fast as the cattle are, though, because they're on the pasture year round, on the watershed year round. Traditional cattle at high density, lots of poop near the stream channel. Ground cover didn't vary that much between ungrazed traditional cattle and bison. And the traditional cattle didn't vary that much. It was fairly high, ground cover below 0.5 meter high. Didn't vary that much because, as I mentioned, that they're very, very aggressive at controlling woody vegetation, either between burning or herbicide additions. But in the patch burn, the ground cover got hammered. And the reason for that was there's trees in the riparian zone during the summer when it's hot. Cattle want to be 1 near water and 2 in the shade. That's more important than eating. At least for part of the day, and they'll just trample everything down in the riparian zone. All 3 conditions of large ungulates put more fine sediments into the stream than the ungrazed one. So there are still bison are still altering water quality by putting sediments into the stream. So we want to get at this in more detail, and these are some ongoing experiments. We just finished a bunch of them this summer, and we're simulating precipitation at that last step before the water gets into the stream. So the rain that falls on the riparian zone, moving materials out into the stream. And this is an example. We're going 3 meters wide, and we're going 12 meters up the stream. This is the bottom one of them, the bottom 6 meters. And this is a sprinkler, and it's going to put about 2 inches of rain in 40 minutes or so on there. And we have Madison and Raihan and Brooke, 3 of my students down there sampling. You can see we put these baffles in so it mixed across the stream channel. We can get all the average across of what came in the stream channel. This is the first run of these type of experiments, a slightly different site. We added bromide as an inert solute, right? Because plants and microbes can't take up bromide. And the gray is when we put the rain on. And this one station was right below where the rain was falling. And then we actually had a 60 meters further down the stream channel. And we see the bromide comes, it falls off fairly rapidly. We get a little bit of transient storage in there. As we go further, we get a little bit more, and it takes longer for the pulse to get through. N15 comes on, drops off fairly rapidly in nitrate. It gets spread out more downstream. We can look at the mass of bromide. Here's the total that we put in. Some of it ended up in the soil. A lot of it made it up down into the stream below. We look at the mass of N15. Almost none of it ended up in the soil. The grass didn't have any bromide in it because plants don't take bromide up any appreciably. But this was actually a month later. The grasses had taken almost all the N15 up. They were the biggest thing to take the nitrogen up. And they took up about 10% of the nitrogen that went in. And we couldn't find a lot of the rest of it, which is typical for N15 study. We can still use the ratio of bromide to bromide to N15 to get uptake and calculate some of those parameters. So we're repeating those experiments. And again, the Madison's madly analyzing data now, and they'll go off to the mass spec and we'll get more. This one happens to be one. You can see the rain coming down. Again, we're in a long rectangle. This is in the bison area. And I mentioned they like the C3 grasses, and they don't care about heat so much, but they do care about cold when it's really cold. So they'll be down near the streams. The C3 grasses are growing in the winter still. The C4 grasses don't have much nutrition to them. And they trampled this area, and a lot of sediment came off. And they also like it, I think, because the trees are kind of scratchy. So in the spring, they come down and they've got those shaggy old winter coats on, and so you can kind of see there's like hair hanging off of this thing, but it was hair hanging off a lot of those trees. Again, the bromide comes through, and then it drops off after we do the release. These numbers are not zero down there. There's just total suspended solids in the stream coming off. It's just so low concentration relative to what came off, even in a 40-minute 2-inch rain. Thousands of times higher numbers coming off there, and falling off fairly quickly after we stopped the rain. So we're thinking about this in terms of the hot spots of sediment generation and maybe nutrients coming into the streams. And we redid the experiment right up here in this vegetated zone, exactly the same. We got 0 bromide in the stream channel. It just did not even make it off. So that vegetation held it back much relative to the trampled sediment area. We're going to scale this. We did 5 this summer, and we'll scale it up to whole watershed surveys of bare soil and cut banks and cattle trails and bison trails and that kind of thing. Another big change we're seeing on Kanza, and this is from the USGS station at the bottom, is a substantial decrease in discharge from this watershed, and it's wholly in tallgrass prairie. And we see that we have about half the discharge between 1985 and 2020 coming off the system. This is a 5-year running mean. So the top graph is just the mean. The 5-year running median, that gives us an idea of the degree of intermittence, because when the median is 0, that means the stream was not flowing for more than half of the year. So we get more pronounced intermittence as we move further and further into this time series. If you have a great analysis for that, I'd be happy to hear about it, since we have our time series analysis expert in the audience. We looked at temperatures just increased slightly over this time period. Precipitation has not changed substantially. So the calculated ET has not come up very much in this time period, but the woody vegetation has increased. The calculated ET for just grasses, excuse me. Woody vegetation has come up about 2 times the ET for a deep-rooted plant than a grass. And that's probably what explains this. And we wanted to see what that effect was on a whole watershed, because you can't do a 50-meter removal and see much of a hydrologic effect. Can we reverse these trends with active management? Do we see other ecosystem shifts that we couldn't see at small scales? We took 4.8 kilometers of the stream channel into one watershed, 30 meters on each side of the main channel, 10 meters on each side channels. We recut the woody shrubs in the winter and the trees in the winter every 2 years, and it was burned every 2 years. And this one just came out in Eco Apps if you have any interest in it. So this is our watersheds here on Kanza in the center of the United States, and we use N2, a Backy design again. The white lines here are the 30-meter wide. The blue ones, you can kind of barely see them, are the 10-meter wide ones. And then the two control watersheds were N4 and N1. You'll see we have a long time of before data, like probably the Backy, this is probably the longest before that of any experiment that I've seen. So here's before from our friend Google Earth, and then we cut in 2010 in the winter, and then afterwards you can see open stream channel up and down here, and we did it for 10 years, and you can still see open stream channel. In contrast, here's the annually burned watershed, but it has woody riparian, and that didn't change because we didn't cut it. So it turns out this is a lot of work for a lot of no effect in some ways. So here's our treatment watershed. Here's our annually burned, our 4-year burned here. Open our riparian cover, closed our upland cover. The top row is the shrubby cover. You can see shrubs are coming up in almost everywhere except for here, and I'll explain that a little bit. So we cut, and the shrubs went down a little bit, but boy, you know, by 10 years they're back up maybe even more than they were before. In the trees, we didn't quite, so this sampling is a little bit wider. So these are outside of 30 meters wide from the edge of the riparian zone, but we did successfully cut out trees. They didn't grow back in 10 years, which you'd expect. But if we sum these two things, right, we get this dip here, but by the time we get here, the response of the shrubs basically made up for that. We have riparian cover with shrubs. This didn't happen in our control watersheds. The reason for this is we cut in the winter time, the trees translocate and shrubs translocate stuff down into their roots. The trees, most of them can't sprout out very fast, but shrubs resprout from basally, and they actually put more sprouts out than they would have. The reason this one's decreasing is because the tree canopy is starting to shade them out, and eventually you'll get into a deciduous forest with not so much shrub cover in the bottom. The biggest ecosystem effect we saw was in nitrate, and this is in micrograms per liter, and this is a log scale. So we started, I don't know, something like 8 micrograms per liter, and then we maybe got up to 9 on average. A lot of variation here, and there's the cutting. All of a sudden, we're up over an order of magnitude of nitrate. So a bunch of nitrate poured out of that system for 3 years, and then boom, right back down to where it was before. The reason we think this happened is that we did kill trees and some shrubs. They had the nutrients in their roots, and those roots broke down and they dumped out their nutrients, and the demand was down. So we got this flush of nitrogen out. I promise you, I'd at least hypothesized about the denitrification rates in the prior work and smaller scale work. We think the same thing happened. Nitrogen became more available, and there was more nitrogen, extractable nitrate in the woody riparian zone soils. Our controls, N1 no change, N4 no change. Why this is going up continuously, this we don't know. That's something we'll have to think about. DOC seems to be going up in at least 2 of these watersheds, maybe not N4. But it wasn't affected. So we took a major source, a potential source of carbon, knocked it out to some degree, but wasn't affected very much. The carbon stayed in the soil, the nitrate didn't. What I think about this is, and the hook of this paper in part, was that we have these really long-term trends in the system. And there's this whole idea that people have about alternative stable states, and like there's this one stable state and there's this other stable state. what this system is on a trajectory, and it's on a stable trajectory towards a different ecosystem state, which is probably deciduous forest cover, but we're not 100% sure. And we knocked that trajectory really hard, and it just kind of popped back, right? So this is what I think many of the ecosystems on the planet are going to be like for most of our lives now with global climate change. They're going to be on alternative trajectory, and at least over the times, you know, trees have a longer lifespan than we do, right? And they take longer to develop on given in longer generation times. This is what we're going to see in many of our ecosystems. Carbon influx, we think we had an effect on our experiment. So we have these litter traps down in the gallery forest. Every year, 4 times a year, students go out, pull a bunch of litter trap samples, weigh them, separate them out into seeds and all that kind of stuff. And the total amount, as those deciduous forests have developed over the 40 years, has almost doubled. So there's a lot of organic carbon that's falling down out of those forests. Bigger forests, more leaves. Okay, yeah, not rocket science, but I guess I wouldn't know how much, you know, and this tells us roughly with, you know, dry years and wet years and all that stuff in there, you still have a significant effect. So we went into the streams after the last year of cutting in the fall before any flow just washed everything away. Streams being the low point in the landscape, they receive not only what falls down into them, but they also get lateral transport. So there's a big carbon flux in there. We have invertebrates and crayfish and stuff that rely on that. And we see downstream where we got this, that we get this many grams of ash-free, 400 grams per square meter of ash-free dry mass. And in the watershed that we did the removal, but immediately below the weir, where we didn't cut the forest, we get about the same amount. In the watershed where the shrubs took off, that leaf material is not making it into the stream channel. The stream channel is still open. The leaves are fine. They're lower down, right? They're short. The shrubs are shorter. When they fall, then they can degrade faster or get hung up before they laterally transfer in. And one is between. This is the annually burned watershed because it has a small forest, a young forest that's just starting to develop. And yeah, the last response variable was moss cover, and in the treatment watershed, it was about 5% moss cover before we did the removal. And we opened up the stream channel. It got more sun, got dried out, got hotter. After 10 years, down to less than 1%. In contrast, the 4-year burn, where the canopy is getting thicker and thicker, started out at about 1%, ended up at about 3.5–4% mosses. So the mosses got hammered by this. And they're nice long-term sort of indicator species because they grow slowly, and so we are seeing some community shifts in this, and some differences related to the change in riparian canopy. A last minute kind of strange one here. This is a part of a project where we went from the Atlantic rainforest into the Cerrado in Brazil. And the Cerrado is a fire-driven system, but the riparian canopy comes back fairly quickly because it's near the riparian zone, and you have to have a really intense fire to get through that wet system and burn the trees out. And we went out there, and the project was to look at how primary production cascaded to secondary production of invertebrates. And so we were putting oxygen probes in these streams and looking at the diurnal oxygen signals to calculate metabolism. And so the typical trend we saw coming into the system the first time is up here. This is actually during the experiment, but we saw this increase and decrease in oxygen. And, you know, since Odom's papers in the 50s, that's going to be driven by metabolism. You know, the algae pump out the oxygen, and then the lights go down, and the heterotrophs suck down the oxygen again, and it goes up and down, and you can use that to calculate what metabolic rates are. And I looked at these and go, why is this happening? Because here's this forest. This is a pretty dense forest. I mean, you can see it's one ray of light getting through here and here, you know, but not much. How could that be driven? We expect this to be a net, heavily respiratory system. So we went, and, you know, the crazy gringo comes to Brazil, and Davi Cunha, my very appreciated and productive colleague humored me. We got 100 meters of black plastic. We put it over the stream, and that's this gray part here. And we put an oxygen probe above and an oxygen probe below. That's Wesley with his oxygen probe for his dissertation work. And we put the plastic on, and we see this going up and down, and it does the same thing below. And we can take the difference between those and make sure that there's not, that's how you measure the metabolism. I don't have the raw data for, this is the raw data, I mean. Somebody always asks me why this is variable like that. There's probably bugs sitting on there if we didn't have wipers on them, and they get on there and they drop the oxygen down a little bit, and then you pop it back up again. So what we think is happening here, it's again, it's still a hypothesis because we don't have the conductance of the tree trunks, but we think is happening is that the trees early in the morning when the sun comes out are like, okay, let's get things going. They open their stomates, right? Water starts coming up up the trunks out of the roots. They photosynthesize. Tropical sun gets more and more intense. By around noon or so, they're like, oh wait, this is too much. They start closing down their stomates. That water that they're taking right next to the stream channel is anoxic groundwater. They're pumping anoxic groundwater out of the system up the tree trunks. Then the aeration can continue, so the oxygen goes up in that little stream. When they close their stomates again, the groundwater the anoxic groundwater isn't going up. They stop taking up as much out of the stream channel, and the oxygen drops back down again. And we did fun games like had recirculating chambers and stuck roots and calculated up that is this possible. They're respiring pretty high, but probably not high enough. It's more to do with pulling out the water. So this goes back to the function of riparian zones as far as their hydrologic effects, and that can cascade to biogeochemistry, right? Okay, so what might screw up this view of biome-based views of riparian function? Slopes and soil types, right? Those vary independently from biomes. Deserts can be flat, they can be steep, they can be bedrock, or they can be sand, or they can be clay, right? Riparian zones require unique adaptations like flood resistance, continuous anoxia, and rooting zones. Evolution, I said it's not a taxonomic concept, but evolution has not solved every problem in every place. So there may be different responses related to that. And probably most of all, anthropogenic pressures probably override everything else. We saw what happens in the percent cropland or the percent urban in the Midwest, percent urban in Brazil, global climate change. So we think that the shift from C4 grasses that dominate the tallgrass prairie to C3 woody vegetation is driven because the atmospheric carbon dioxide is increasing, almost doubling over the time period that I gave you for these hydrologic trends. The C3 grasses, C4 grasses lose their competitive ability because the C3 plants, if there's twice the CO2, they only have to open their stomates half as much to get the CO2 in. So the C4 grasses being able to put CO2 into their leaves and store it until they need it for photosynthesis and keep their stomates closed, that advantage is going away. Again, an anthropogenic factor that's causing a big change in the biomes that we're seeing in this particular grassland. In conclusion, riparian zones function differently depending upon biomes. I mean, some of this makes sense, right? There's bare soil in deserts. You're going to get more sediments coming in. Grasses versus woody cover, then we can also think of there being some things, and our manipulative experiments show that there's some differences in the streams and the transport of materials. The presence of large ungulate grazers may alter stream ecosystem function. So they're going to interact with the riparian tree canopy where they are and their behavior and change how much material, how that interface acts between the terrestrial and aquatic system. And maybe this is just a given, but riparian zone conversion under global change could have strong effects on stream ecosystems. If we take a biome-based view, we may be able to predict better where the riparian zone biomes are going into the future than if we just view them as being a static thing that's not changing with climate change. That's all I got.
Walter, open up for questions.
Daniel?
One of the last things you said was this transition to C3 plants, and isn't that alternative explanation just that fire frequency and grazing pressure has changed to the point that balance is away from grass?
Well, so we have different frequencies of burning on Kanza, and we burn every year, every 2 years. And what we used to do every 4 years and every 20 years, we don't do 20 years anymore because we know we'll just end up with woody. Even on annually burned watersheds, on average, the woody riparian is expanding more quickly. But expanding, but not as quickly as there's a break point. There's about 1.8 here. So there's this low level of expansion, and then it just rockets when you don't burn. But maybe we can't burn as intensely as happened historically. Low humidity, high wind, high temperature, we cannot light fires. It's against the law.
And where do you cross that with Biden?
So grazing may well be important. Most likely it's important because the elk are not on the system anymore. So bison, don't have much effect on the riparian vegetation in the low lakes. The place I showed you was kind of an exception where they kind of congregated. But we have a student, Jesse Nippert's student, Rory, did experimental shrub removals 3 times a year during the growing season and burned them at the end of that. And he was able to keep them from resprouting. So yes, grazers might interact. And that's sort of why Mongolia has no woody vegetation, because they've got goats up the wazoo there, and they eat everything unless there's an island that keeps them out.
Do you know what this was like 500 years ago? Was there any kind of pollen analysis or?
That one's difficult because we're south of the extent of the furthest southern extent of glaciation, and that's what makes wetlands where you might see pollen, or lakes that you might see pollen. We can get close to there with tree rings, but 500-year-old cedars are tough to find there. The few that have been there, they think that 3 to 4 years was the return frequency of fires. But that's another alternative explanation for this. What if 500 years ago there was a mega drought there, and the shrubs do fine up to some point, and then when all the water's gone, all things being equal, maybe the grasses can get back and take over. So we can guess, but no, we don't know. One thing we do know is the bison herds were not very large in that area, because the closest bison kill sites are to the west by about 150 miles archaeologically. So they were probably more like the woods bison in Yellowstone, where kind of more spread out. They don't have the massive herds that they had in western Kansas and Nebraska and eastern Colorado and such. Dakotas. Yeah, Gordon.
You might have just answered this question, I'll ask it anyway. What about infixers? This is terrestrial infixers. Are they prominent? Are they changing?
We've not seen the change, but there's not. So the leggings don't have a lot of nodulation, one, and I think it's because we've had a lot of atmospheric deposition on it. That goes back to the value of long-term research, though, because there have been people in Illinois and in Iowa that have claimed that there were a lot of nitrogen fixtures on the prairie, and that those were dumping a bunch of nitrogen into the aquatic systems. There's a few anecdotal pictures or settler accounts of there being macrophytes in the rivers or something like that. And they're saying, well, so we can, we've got this cropland, but it has no effect on the Gulf of Mexico, no effect on delivery and the zone of the dead zone that forms at the mouth of the Mississippi. our data suggests that it's fairly low. I do think we're shifting away from it because we used to see nostoc in those streams, and I've not seen nostoc in the streams, although it is it's a nitrogen fixing cyanobacterium. I do see it. It is on the limestone benches where there's not much vegetation in the terrestrial version. But I do like nitrogen fixtures and I love nostoc, so thanks for the question. Do I have any more? Well, thanks for your kind attention. I appreciate it.